I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, and would like to welcome you to today's, this evening's or the mornings, depending on where you are, first in a new series entitled Threats to Press Freedom. I want to begin by acknowledging that the territory on which I am speaking to you tonight is the territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's panel, which are the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network, PEN Canada, and World Press Freedom Canada. Our series on threats to press freedom is going to begin with several looking at threats internationally. We're then going to turn to threats to press freedom in Canada. But we're starting tonight with silencing Kashmir, the state of press freedom in the world's most militarized zone. There were to be 4 panelists tonight, and I'm going to introduce all four, although only 3 of them are able to be with us. The first was to have been Aakash Hassan. Aakash is an impressive independent journalist reporting from Kashmir and mainland China for the past 6 years. He reported for The Guardian, the South China Morning Post, and Al Jazeera, and the Intercept, amongst others. Regrettably, yesterday, Aakash contacted us to say that he has had to withdraw from participation because of security concerns about his safety. I now would like to introduce the 3 panelists who are going to be with us this evening. The first is Kunal Majumder. Kunal is India correspondent for the Committee to Protect Journalists. He has worked with media organizations, including the India Express, the Rajasthan Patrika, and Vice. He won the Statesman Award for Rural Reporting, and he's a visiting faculty member in the Mass Communications Research Center at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. Welcome, Kunal. Our second panelist is Rakib Hameed Naik. Rakib is a journalist from Kashmir, where he's covered conflict and human rights issues before moving to the United States in 2020. He formerly was international correspondent at the Globe Post, and along with Kashmir, he has reported from India and China. Welcome, Rakib. Our third panelist is Geeta Seshu. Geeta is an independent journalist. She's worked at the India Express in Mumbai. She was editor of Soul Curry, an internet portal for women. She was editor of a niche social issues magazine, Humanscape. Since 2010, she has coordinated the Free Speech Hub, an initiative of the media watch site The Hoot, to track freedom of expression in India. She's a founding editor of the Free Speech Collective, set up in 2018 to protect the right to freedom of expression and vigorously promote free speech and the right to dissent. And she's a member of UNESCO's Media Freedom Committee, India. Welcome, Geeta. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this distinguished panel. He's a remarkable Canadian journalist. His name is Julian Scher. He was senior producer at CBC's Fifth Estate, an investigative journalist for the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, author of 6 widely acclaimed books. He's filmed, written, and produced major documentaries across the globe and covered scandals, wars, and corporate intrigue in many countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, South Africa, Somalia, Holland, France, Canada, Costa Rica, Mexico. I could go on with the list. It's quite impressive. He's a winner and 3-time winner of 1 and 3-time nominee for a Gemini, Canada's equivalent to the Emmys for TV. He's a recipient of the Governor General's Award for Meritorious Public Service for uncovering miscarriages of justice. And most recently, he's been training journalists in Bangladesh, training Syrian journalists in Turkey, and Arab journalists in Jordan, and doing training for Al Jazeera. Welcome, Julia.
Glad to be here.
The format for tonight's event is that Julian and the panelists are going to have a conversation for 45 to 55 minutes, and then they're going to turn to you, the audience, to answer any questions that you may have. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And at any point during their conversation, if you have a question, if a question comes to mind, please just click on the Q&A button, write down your question. And when we get to that point in the program, Julian will turn to Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center and is monitoring the questions, to ask the first question. And we'll go through the questions and have an opportunity for you to join into the conversation. I think that's all I have to say. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all of you who are taking the time, either if it's evening or morning, wherever you are around the world. Right now, a lot of the world's attention, of course, is focused at the horrible events going on in Ukraine. And I'm glad you're able to take the time to pay attention to Kashmir, because Kashmir has been probably one of the world's longest, but also least understood conflicts. And part of our goal tonight is to introduce to you through the voices and stories of three people who know Kashmir really well, why this conflict is so important and why it's important we don't ignore it in the face of everything that's going on in the world today. I really want to play as little as role as possible and have Kunal and Geeta and Rakib talk and exchange. We're going to look at three big issues in the next hour, and then we hope to have plenty of time for you to ask your questions to our terrific experts. We'll start off with a brief history to give everybody the context they need about Kashmir, why it's become such a flashpoint, and what happened in 2019 that changed things so dramatically. Then we'll move on to our second block, where we'll look at some of the personal stories that journalists face, Rakib himself, and then stories that Kunal and Geeta know from people they've been in contact with. And then our third and final block will be the fight for press freedoms now and in the future. And we'll wrap with how you in the audience can help get involved and find more about this. So settle in for I think a really exciting and important hour. So let's start right at the beginning. I think many people know, unfortunately, very little about Kashmir. So Rakib, maybe you could start by giving us a brief history of Kashmir and why it has become such a flashpoint in the region.
Sure, Jim. So Jammu and Kashmir is a Muslim majority region. It was an independent princely state before the partition of the Indian subcontinent. The Hindu king who ruled Kashmir back in 1947 had an option to choose between Pakistan and India, and he chose to accede with the latter. He signed an instrument of accession giving India control over Kashmir's foreign affairs, defense, and communications. After the subsequent wars between India, Pakistan, and China, the different parts of the region were divided between these three countries. There are many theories surrounding the Treaty of Accession and why the Hindu king chose to go with India. Nevertheless, the treaty promised to decide Kashmir's future according to the will of its people. And in 1948, when India took Kashmir to United Nations, the UN also called for a referendum to be held in the region for the people to decide their future. Even the then Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, while delivering a speech in Lal Chowk, promised Kashmiri people to hold a plebiscite as soon as normalcy was restored in the region. The plebiscite never took place, and that's the main reason and the main issue at the core of conflict in Kashmir today. The first major uprising against Indian rule in Kashmir took place in late 1980s when India rigged the regional elections, resulting in an armed insurgency. India responded brutally by rushing hundreds and thousands of troops to the region to curb the uprising. And the subsequent years, unfortunately, saw massacres, grave human rights violations, torture, enforced disappearances, and sexual violence against women. And some of these topics I have covered very closely. Human rights organizations quote the number of people dead in the last 3 decades of conflict to at least 100,000. And between 2008 and 2016, Kashmir has witnessed at least 3 major uprisings. And in these uprisings, hundreds of young men were killed in the street protests. And in 2010, India introduced the controversial pellet guns in the region that led to blindings of hundreds of young men. The doctors back in 2016, I remember, while they were receiving these huge casualties in their hospitals, they used this particular term to define the world situation, and they called it as the epidemic of blindness. It was in 2016. And almost 2.5 years back, on 5th of August 2019, India rescinded Kashmir's special status and revoked its degree of autonomy that was granted under Article 370 of Indian Constitution. Since then, Kashmir has been under siege, with all the fundamental human rights and freedoms trampled by the Indian state. And silencing, punishing, and battering press is very much part of that broader crackdown.
Geeta, and can anything to add to that, especially what the conflict in Kashmir means for the whole region, and then also for the rest of the world?
Well, Kashmir has been a very contentious aspect of India's history and also of the region. And I think the sad part is that very few people in India know as much of this history beyond what they are told in the media that they are exposed to. I can recall a very interesting little segment in a film, in a documentary made by Sanjay Kak called Jasne Azadi, where there is this bunch of Indians who go to Kashmir, and they love the scenery, they love the scenic aspects of Kashmir. It's a very beautiful place, and they insist that Kashmir belongs to them. So the sense of belonging, the sense of this notion of Kashmir as belonging to the rest of India, without any understanding of what the people of Kashmir really want, and without even wanting to listen, I think has dominated a lot of our, very unfortunately dominated a lot of our discourse on Kashmir. So today, when journalists are so severely under attack, when they are not able to speak because they're not able to write, they're not able to, put out the stories of the people of Kashmir, which interestingly enough, they did very, very effectively. We had a very vibrant media that a lot of stories from Kashmir, and they're not being heard. So there is this complete silence, despite the fact that, we've had Article 37, the abrogation of 370, and a complete communication breakdown there because there was this clampdown. Despite all of that, the stories were still coming out. And now the people who are telling these stories are not being allowed to speak. So it is really tragic, very, very tragic.
We'll get into that silencing, obviously, in a moment. But Kunal, I'm wondering if you and the others can, before we move on to press freedoms as such, Geeta talked about the silencing, and why do you all think Kashmir is one of the longest yet the littlest known of the conflicts, right? If you asked ordinary people, obviously everybody's thinking of Ukraine now, but people will talk about Syria or Afghanistan. People who are maybe following things more closely might talk about Yemen, right? But unfortunately, Kashmir, there is this silencing. So to what do you attribute that, Kunal and the others?
Julian, I think one thing that we need to do is also take a step back and understand that the conflict is not just between the Kashmiri people and the Indian state, but also there is another country involved, two other countries involved in the whole game. While of course today we are talking about press freedom in the Indian controlled Kashmir. There is also a Pakistan controlled Kashmir, and there is a tiny bit of China controlled Jammu and Kashmir. I won't say just Kashmir. So we have to also understand that one of the reasons that you asked, why is it one of the longest running conflicts? Because it's a very complex conflict. It doesn't merely stop at, there are multiple actors in play. There are multiple factors in play. The Indian state has always insisted, I mean, while Rakib pointed out that at the core is the plebiscite that should have ideally been held because Indian government promised it at the UN level. But the Indian government insists that at the core is actually the separatist movement in Kashmir, which has been played by Pakistan, and the militancy, which to an extent is very clearly proven has a lot of Pakistani support. So since 1990s, there has been a lot of violence in the valley. Some of it indigenous from within the Kashmiri people, and a lot of it also imported or exported by Pakistan into Indian controlled Kashmir. So I think to simplify, I think one of the reasons that this is the longest running conflict perhaps in the world history, along with Israel-Palestine issue, is primarily because there are so many actors and nobody seems to agree on what exactly is the core issue. If you ask the Kashmiri people, they will say something else. You ask the Indian state, they will say something else. If you ask the Pakistani, they will mention something else. And between all of this, the people who are suffering are the common Kashmiris, whether they are in the Pakistan side or in the Indian side. And since, as both Rakib and Geeta mentioned, since 2019 August, we are seeing the Indian state becoming far more assertive and even taking away whatever liberties or little freedom that the Kashmiris enjoyed, and particularly the Kashmiri press.
So speaking about the press, before we get to the big change in 2019, if Rakib, Geeta, and you, Kunal, can talk about, in this history that all three of you have so well explained, what overall was the role of journalists and Kashmir media in telling the stories before the crackdown in 2019? How good was the reporting? How good was it in building bridges? Did the media inflame some of the tensions? Maybe Rakib, you can talk because you were there, but give us a sense of the history, the role that the media played over the last decades.
Oh yeah, Julian, of course, whatever the world knows a little bit about Kashmir, it's just because of the courageous and brave journalism done by Kashmiris down here over the past more than 3 decades. Whatever we have known about, like my knowledge of history, like we were talking about the history of Kashmir until 2009, I didn't even know the history of my place, because the history books that we were taught in school, they were all propaganda of the Indian state. And it was just after the advent of internet, I got introduced to internet, started exploring, researching, getting to read these articles by these good journalists back in time. I got to know about the real history of my place, what has been happening since 1987 onwards. So the work done by journalists over the past more than 3 decades has been courageous. They have written the history of Kashmir with their own blood, literally by because they risked everything they had to cover these stories. So the work done by journalists in Kashmir has been tremendous, and especially after 2019. As you mentioned, the work of journalists in Kashmir has become really difficult because one of the main objectives of Indian authorities in the region have been to disrupt the informational funnel between Kashmir and the rest of the world. And traditional media like newspapers, magazines, TV channels were already under immense pressure to toe the line before 2019. were deprived of the crucial government advertisements that are the main source of their revenue. And what happened was that after silencing the traditional media post 2019, they went after independent news websites in the region and freelance journalists reporting for national and international publications. And in this case, the state didn't have a leverage because these folks, these journalists do not rely on government advertisements. So what the authorities did as a first step was to scale up threats, intimidation, harassment, physical assaults, beatings at checkpoints, midnight raids. And now it has escalated to an all new level of extrajudicial detentions, arrests under draconian terrorism laws, and sedition. And over the last more than 3 years, we have seen arrest of journalist Asif Sultan. He's a colleague. He's in jail since past more than 3 years for a story he wrote. Journalist Shujat Bukhari was arrested and put in jail under the Lawless Public Safety Act, a law that allows for detention for up to 2 years without trial. Just 2 weeks back, Fahad Shah, the owner and editor of news website Kashmir Wala, was arrested under sedition and UAPA. It's a draconian terrorism law. 2 other journalist friends of mine are being actively investigated by National Investigative Agency, which is equivalent of FBI in the US. And other colleagues are frequently called to police stations, picked up in midnight raids, beaten, jailed, their families intimidated. And the pace at which Indian securities are going after journalists in Kashmir, to me, it looks like it is only going to get worse in coming weeks, months, and years, unfortunately.
I think we want to hear a lot more about some of your personal experiences and the experiences of some of the people you just mentioned. Just before we get there, could maybe Geeta or Kunal, could one or both of you explain what Rakib was referred to? What happened in 2019? You gave us the history, but in 2019, what happened that changed dramatically the already endangered freedoms of the media?
Shall I?
Yes, sure.
So basically in August 2019, the Indian Parliament abrogated this particular section in the Indian Constitution, which gave a certain amount of autonomy. You know, Rakib mentioned that when Jammu and Kashmir merged into the Indian Union, there were certain areas which were no-go for the Indian state, and Indian state had to only deal with, I think, 3 foreign affairs, telecom, and their defense, I think 3 or 4 areas. But over the last 75 odd years, the Indian government slowly started taking away, kind of intruding into the Kashmiri constitution and the agreement, and which eventually kind of 19 is basically a culmination of all of this. It's not just that it suddenly happened. I mean, and quite frankly, it's not just that this government did it. All the previous Indian governments did it as well. They started chipping away slowly. And then finally, in August 19, they took away whatever was left of the autonomy that was left of Jammu and Kashmir. And as I'm again repeating, not that they were immensely enjoying any level of freedom, but whatever was left of it in August 19, that was taken away. The state was divided. And divided into 2 parts, one being Ladakh, another Jammu and Kashmir. Ladakh is a Buddhist majority region, and Jammu and Kashmir, with Kashmir being Muslim majority and Jammu being Hindu. Overall, I guess still it's Muslim majority, the entire region. And then not just that, but they brought down the status of the region from a state to a union territory, which means it's now directly ruled by Delhi. So it kind of really stripped away a lot of not just autonomy, but basic rights, which from a point where compared to other Indian states, they had a little more, to a situation where now they're not even a proper state.
Geeta, anything to add to that about the changes?
Yes, I think what I would like to focus on, I mean, to add to what Kunal and Rakib have said, is the manner in which all of this was done. The people of Kashmir were absolutely unaware of, or didn't expect any of this kind of very, very sudden, abrogation of Article 370. about a month after this, the abrogation, Free Speech Collective, that's my colleague Lakshmi Murthy and I went to Kashmir because we were so, we really wanted to record what was happening in the face of the most unprecedented kind of shutdown of communication in Kashmir. Just before the Article 370 was abrogated on August 5. So from August 4 onwards, the internet completely shut down in Kashmir, and not just the internet, but landlines were shut down. There was absolutely no way in which the people of Kashmir could even communicate with one another, even communicate in terms of, the next door neighbors and finding out what is happening with them. So there was a complete shutdown. It was really unprecedented for this region, and I'm told even across the world. Now, in the absence of this kind of basic communication that people could have with one another, there was absolutely no way in which people could even understand what happened to them. So they learned about what was happening. They learned about the abrogation from, from some kind of very, very, unofficial sort of communication. And there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of panic. This is not the way any democratic country should be dealing with its citizens in the first place. There has to be dialogue. There has to be engagement. There was none of that. So, so in this, and apart from that, of course, a lot of, majority of Kashmiri political leaders were taken into custody, and some of them were kept in house arrest. So there was also a lot of fear about that. Journalists themselves had absolutely no way of communicating, getting information about what was happening in district, apart from Srinagar. So it was really an incredible situation for anyone to have to go through an experience. One day, sometime in early August, just before the clampdown, a journalist, Qazi Shibli, was detained for tweeting about troop deployment, which was the one signal, massive deployment of troops in that entire area just before the abrogation actually happened. So that was a kind of signal that something was happening. And he was detained because he tweeted about it. There were prohibitory orders against, prohibitory orders, but Gauhar Gilani, for instance, was about to travel overseas on 31st August, and he was not allowed to because this was a way of preventing him from speaking out in international platforms. We now know, of course, that he is, that there is an arrest warrant against him. So there's been, I think this kind of clamp down on any kind of information is really any kind of independent information, because what the government did was have press briefings, and they had people fly in from Delhi. They were allowed to move about. They were allowed to collect information and put information out, which the government wanted them to. So this clampdown was really about a very specific kind of narrative which was being put out. And interestingly enough, we kept having the government say everything is normal. So the notion of normalcy itself really is something that we all need to constantly question and challenge.
Well, this is a perfect segue into what I think is the most important part of the talk from the three of you, some personal stories about the challenges based on everything, the bigger picture you've presented so well, the challenges that journalists have faced. Kunal has worked with CPJ, so you'll be able to tell us some of the cases you were involved with. And I know, Geeta, you're involved in collecting the voices from Kashmir. But let's start with you, Rakib, your personal story. Jim introduced it at the beginning, but can you tell us your personal story? You have a lot less gray hair than I am, so you're very young. You're full of fire and determination. But I'm curious, how did you start as a journalist? What were your dreams and hopes? What did you do to carry out your work? And then, of course, why did you have to flee? Why did you have to flee your homeland?
Julian, if I may, sorry, interject before Rakib
Absolutely.
starts. I just wanted to, because Geeta mentioned the time and the trying to control the narrative, and Rakib, I'm sure, was there at that time in Srinagar. If he could, like, before going to his personal story, if he could share with us, how did that control happen? There was this
Yeah.
one room with computers. It's just amazing and shocking, because even I traveled to Kashmir a month after, and it was shocking to see almost an appetite between Kashmiri journalists and mainland journalists traveling to Kashmir. So if Rakib could also share that before he goes to his personal story.
Oh, unbelievable. Yes, yes.
Sure, Jay. And by the way,
And-
Kunal and myself, we got in touch just because of August 5th, 2019.
And
Yeah,
Geeta, you were going to jump in?
each other. Yeah, that was the first time we spoke to each other, August 6th, 2019, a day after India rescinded
Wow.
Kashmir special status. Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I just wanted to add here that this was a completely illegal shutdown. There was absolutely no, India has laws which are supposed to govern our internet, and it's supposed to govern the way in which the internet is shut down in India. There's supposed to be procedures, but none of them were followed. And when Anuradha Bhasin, who was the Kashmir Times editor, actually tried to challenge this in the Indian Supreme Court, there was no the court just finally heard it after months and said that that there has to be some kind of procedure in place, and didn't offer any sort of relief. So this was actually totally illegal, even from a standpoint of free speech and democracy.
And
Okay,
if
take
I
it
may
away,
just
Rakib.
add,
Oh, yep.
yeah, and if I may
Sure.
also add the usage. So another, and we saw this with Shibli and other political players who were detained, the usage of the Public Safety Act, which is absolutely arbitrary and draconian, and that's something now that's also being used against Shujat Bukhari and other journalists, which basically doesn't give you any right to bail or even hearing for at least 3 months. So you are behind bars for 3 to 6 months at the will of the state, and you have no judicial rights. You have no rights, and bail in India, by the way, is a default right. This is a Supreme Court judgment, and that was completely violated. As Geeta mentioned, we don't even want to look at international standards. Even by Indian standards, this was completely, there were multiple layers of illegality of what happened in Kashmir on that month, in that month.
Okay, so let me jump in. So first of all, I would like to make a comment on what really happened on August 5th, 2019. So to make it very simple and clear, for every Kashmiri, August 2019 was a month of trauma. And that is a kind of trauma every Kashmiri is going to carry with them for the rest of their lives. And I have lived that trauma. And I remember on August 4th, 2019, I was shooting a documentary on rampant construction of dams in Kashmir. It's another story how India is exploiting Kashmir's natural resources at the cost of environment. I was shooting a documentary and I was in a very distant location. I made it back to the main town, and I was just getting my car cleaned and everything. It was 8 in the night, and I was just going to go and crash in some motel nearby. And that was when I received a call from one of my journalist friends, and he told me, you need to run, go to home, something is going to happen. I asked him, what happened? It's like, something is going to happen in the next few hours. I wasn't sure. I got in the car with my friend, drove all the way to Chenab Valley, which is like maybe 300 miles away from there. And the roads in there are not like something like in Canada or US. To cover 300 miles, it takes more than 12 to 13 hours. I drove, and I remember at 3 a.m. in the morning, I was like 70 miles away from my hometown. There was this army checkpoint, young army soldiers on the streets in their fresh uniforms. They stopped me and told me I can move ahead. There is a martial law like, emergency in the state. All the powers have been taken. They explicitly told me all the powers in the state have been taken over by the army, by the central government, by the federal government. Police is not in the control. You can move, you have to stop here until we get instructions. Finally, some calls and everything. The phone was working at that time. It was 3 a.m. Calls, they let us go through. And then across the whole way, I saw thousands of cars, young people, young men who were studying across the state, scrambling to make it to home because they know something bad was going to happen, but police has stopped them. They were not allowing them to move to their houses. And then at 5, there was no network, like, I couldn't like surf internet or get any calls. And we didn't know that, like, they were going to have such a blackout in the region. And I reached home at 6. My parents were out of the country. My sister, my younger sister, my younger brother, they were all scared, like they didn't sleep the whole night. I made it home, and then we didn't sleep. And we were just looking glued to the TV, waiting for what was going to unfold. And then at around 10, I don't remember the exact time, that was when the Indian Parliament and the session of the Parliament announced abrogation of Article 370. And my sister, my younger brother, they started crying. And the fear, I still remember, I can't even explain. Like, I think every Kashmiri was like, in shivers that particular day. Because, we had never seen, I was born and raised in Kashmir, had seen conflict, was raised under the shadows of guns, but had never witnessed that kind of thing. Outside my house, there were 100 soldiers sitting there, not allowing anyone to go out. We were not allowed to go out to buy bread, anything for 4 or 5 days. We had to live on very little. So I can't even explain the scale. And let's not talk about illegality or so. I think if you define it by any human standards, you can't even compare to any of that. It was such grave, and as I said earlier, this is a kind of trauma that we Kashmiris are going to have it on our backs for the rest of our life.
This happened to you, how old were you when this happened, and what did it mean in terms of your dreams? Why did you start as a journalist? What were your hopes? And what did this shattering mean when you're there huddling with your siblings, scared for your lives? What made you a journalist?
Okay, that's a long story. Yeah, but I'll keep it pretty brief. Well, I started my career as a journalist in 2014. It was the same year, unfortunately, the current Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi came to power in India, and later stitched an alliance with the regional party in Kashmir, and hence the most challenging times for us as journalists and publishers in the region. Harassment, intimidation, beatings were pretty common, as they have always been over the last more than 3 decades of conflict in Kashmir. There were times when I was also physically assaulted by members of security forces while reporting from the ground. And I remember this particular incident in 2015 while I was reporting from South Kashmir, and security forces aimed their pellet guns towards a bunch of journalists who were covering that protest. And 2 pellets, 1 pellet hit my abdomen area, 1 on the thumb. Unfortunately, no life-threatening injuries, but yeah, that's what I think. I was fortunate enough. What other journalists have gone through in the valley, it's worse. I did had a slight idea that worst was about to come, but not as worse that 7 years down the line, I would have to literally flee my homeland, leave everything behind, my people, my family, my friends, with the possibility of never seeing them ever again. It actually started on August 15, 2019, 10 days after India rescinded Kashmir's special status, when members of Intelligence Bureau, it's India's domestic counterintelligence agencies, questioned me at my home for 3 straight days. They then orally summoned me to report at their office. The harassment and intimidation went on and off for next 8 to 10 months after August 2019, but it escalated to a whole new level when in July 2020, few men tried to force their entry into my house at 3 a.m. It was
where were you?
In Dora.
Wow.
Dora, yeah. And and in a place like Kashmir, anyone can, come and bump you off without anybody ever knowing who really did it. I had very few options on my hands. The same year, Hindu nationalists put me on one of their hit lists for my reporting on minorities in India and conflict in Kashmir. My family and I, we both were constantly trying to protect each other. But with my journalistic work and presence in the region, it was getting difficult to do that anymore. I had two options in hand, either to self-censor myself, maybe quit journalism, or just move out of the country and keep doing my work. And I chose the latter. I chose the latter, to leave my homeland. And in August 2020, during the first COVID wave and the strict lockdown, I flew to the US. And since then, I am here in a self-imposed exile. This is what I call it. I haven't seen my family in the last few years, and I don't know when I'll get to see them. Maybe 3 to 5 years, or maybe never. But that's
It's an amazing story of courage, Rakib. And we want to come back to talk about the work you're doing now, the fact that you're not giving up the fight. But you mentioned reaching out to Kunal. Kunal, can you talk a bit about the work you did for the CPJ and some of the stories of the people you met and investigated? Fahad Shah, Asif, Sultan, anybody else you want to mention. But tell us some of the personal stories and investigations you uncovered after you got that call from Rakib.
Actually, before I got that call from Rakib, so in many sense, my work at CPJ somehow has coincided with whatever has been happening in Kashmir, and it's only kind of, I always say this government ensures that I'm always busy. So I think the first case I recall, and we were traveling to Kashmir, in fact, me and one of my colleagues, and we were traveling to Kashmir, and the same evening I got a call from my boss who mentioned that Asif Sultan's father had tried to get in touch, and there was this journalist, Asif Sultan, again young like Rakib, not many years in journalism, used to work for this news magazine called Kashmir Narrator. He had done a reportage on a separatist militant who was assassinated, killed by the Indian forces, and then once he had done this particular story, he was picked up for questioning and then subsequently charged under the draconian UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is the anti-terror law in India. And since then, this was August 2018, Rakib is still in jail. His trial is going on at a really slow pace. He had a child who he has never met. So that's the situation. Kashmir Monitor had to completely shut down. There was raids on the house of the Kashmir Monitor editor just recently, Kashmir Narrator, yeah. And Kashmir Narrator, and then Saukat's house was raided. Saukat Mota was the editor recently. And it's quite a struggle for the family. I've been in touch with the family. The brother is a college lecturer. The father is a retired government official. The parents wanted Rakib to actually become a doctor. And that's one of the favorite, in Kashmir, you'll find a lot of journalists and doctors. So, and he was a very smart kid who could have gone into medicine and perhaps made a ton of money, but decides to be a journalist because that's what his passion is. And his brother, whenever we talk, Omar keeps mentioning all of this. And look what's happened to him just over one story. And not that he had any massive body of work writing against the Indian state. And quite frankly, even the story wasn't against the Indian state. I mean, I remember having a conversation with somebody who works at one of the leading think tanks in Delhi. And he was shocked. He said, that particular piece of article was so informative, even from an Indian intelligence point of view, because it brings out a lot of details. But here he is. And so that's Rakib's case. I think he's the longest imprisoned journalist at this moment, almost my tenure and his term in jail kind of coincides around 3.5 years in prison. It's horrendous, and no bail, nothing. And then, of course, the latest case of the last two cases that we have seen, one is Sajjad Gul, again, somebody that we've been in touch with for a long time, because when he's a journalist from North Kashmir, if I'm not mistaken, Rakib, correct me. And he was previously, this is Sajjad Gul. And he was previously targeted as well when he was covering a protest. They had filed an FIR, which is First Information Report Against Her, which is basically an opening of an investigation into anyone. It's called FIR in India. So he was initially kind of targeted with a FIR on a day that he was not even there in that place. There was a protest, and whoever filed this FIR is a government official who claimed that he was there in a protest, and he had thrown stones at the armed forces, which is generally an accusation against anybody, the general accusation against anybody the Indian state wants to target. So, but he proved through phone records that he was actually in Srinagar that day, and yet they went ahead with the investigation. And then he later joined Kashmir Wala, which is this independent, first a magazine and then turned into an online publication, which is headed by Fahad Shah. And then he basically on his Facebook page posted some information about a killing. Now I don't know whether it's extrajudicial or not. I don't want to pass that. But the family's reaction, basically, the person who was killed, the family's reaction. So it was not that he was suggesting anything or he was taking a position. He was merely reporting things as it is. If the family has. And first they targeted him with some minor violations of minor laws. And then when he manages to get the bail, the next day, instead of letting him out, they kind of imposed PSA, which is Public Safety Act, which I mentioned previously, has no bail for 3 to 6 months. It could be 6 months if the state wills. So, and then he was sent off to Jammu jail. So it's just, imagine, and this is exactly what they did with Fahad as well. So in Fahad's case, Fahad has constantly been on the radar for quite some time, quite frankly, and much like Rakib, we've been in touch with Fahad for many years now. And he would constantly tell me, like, for example, he's coming from, let's say, Jammu after reporting something and crossing some tunnel which connects to the valley, and he would be stopped, and then he would be questioned. And, there's a lot of constant harassments, being summoned to the police station over stories. And this is happening with a lot of Jammu and Kashmir journalists, especially Kashmir journalists, constantly being called by the cops and the intelligence department to ask, and they're like just having a chat, quote unquote, and mostly in the police stations. There is a police station in Kashmir called the Cargo, where most of these people are sitting and interrogating the journalists. So now Fahad's case, there were already multiple investigations that were opened into him for stories done both by him individually as well as his publication. I think at the moment there are 3. The latest one happened once again, and we see this as a trend where journalists reporting on reactions to excesses by the armed forces. Reactions, they are not reacting. Reactions by the family on excesses to the armed forces are now being held or being targeted or are being called. And this in many sense also leads up to the media policy, which I hope after this we can discuss, where into 2020, the Jammu and Kashmir government administration, I'd rather not call it government, came up with a media policy in which the state now decides what's a fake news and what's not a fake news. And accordingly, decides to take actions, whether that's withdrawal of advertisements or, like summoning of journalists and et cetera, et cetera. So completely kind of quashing on even any qualms of press freedom that ever existed before. So that's the important thing. And then, just kind of returning back to Fahad's story, he's first summoned, he's questioned, well and good, and then he's let off. He keeps all of us informed. And then the next day he's again summoned back, and he said that why don't you come to record your statement? As in, it's recorded, need to sign it. But they never let him go, and they arrest him. And
Amazing.
and then after 22 days, he finally gets a bail, that too from a NIA court, which is the National Intelligence Agency's court. And the same day that his gets the bail, within hours when the family is waiting outside the jail for him to emerge, they decide to rearrest him on another charge. So now there are three. So it's like, you get a bail, so you just keep going merry-go-round.
And never ends.
Yeah, so that's what happened. And it's just, and Geeta mentioned about Gohar Gilani. Gohar Gilani is another senior journalist who at the moment is not even like doing regular journalism. He writes one infrequently, and it's mostly posting stuff on social media. There is an FIR, there is an arrest warrant, actually a court sanctioned arrest warrant against him, and he has to go into hiding. I mean, I don't know where he is, and we've not been in touch with him, but yeah.
We only have about 10 minutes before I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and I hope the questions from the audience will allow all of you to also give us a forward-looking sense of what's coming. But in the 10 minutes we have left, Geeta, I want to get to Rakib and what you're doing right now, Rakib, as a journalist in exile. But Geeta, any personal stories you have to share? You've been working on the voices and trying to get out those voices. So give us a couple of the stories that you think it's important people to know about.
Yeah, very briefly before I go into the voices, I think we need to understand the media ecosystem in Kashmir. There are about 400 and odd empaneled newspapers in Kashmir. There is no television channel, no independent television channel, no independent broadcast media, but there are lots the internet has resulted in a number of Kashmiri newspapers going into using the internet also. Now, these are very, very heavily dependent on government advertising. So the media policy that Kunal referred to, and which I had done a detailed study of, was something that came out a year after 2019, after the abrogation. And this was a new media policy, and it was very, very stringent in the kind of the guidelines by which media, the newspapers, would be able to get advertising. Now, in the absence of a parallel or an independent economic activity, which was actually very, very rich in Kashmir. There was a lot of trade, there was a lot of, other kinds of independent economic activity, despite all those years of conflict, which could sustain the media. So in this absence, we've had journalists who've lost jobs because their newspapers had to close down. And more than about, at that time, soon after the abrogation, we found that many journalists were not paid salaries, so they lost jobs. They don't have any access to employment of any kind. They've had to depend upon whatever little bits of, employment opportunities they could get. So this is also another way in which the media was being curbed, because it was not able to function. The only way in which media can sustain itself is if they agree to government press notes, government information, if they toe the line in that sense. So that's also something which I wanted to talk about. Now, when you've asked me to, we've been recording voices, and the report that we came out with actually has a whole lot of voices from Kashmir, and all of them we've anonymized because we didn't want to have people speak and put themselves at risk. But the voice I really want to start with is somebody who has been permanently silenced, and that is Shujat Bukhari. When I worked with the Hoot which is a Media Watch website, Shujat sent me his research project on the use of the Public Security Act against the media in Kashmir. And it's quite, I must dig it out again and recirculate this document, because he did a two-part piece for us. And he said then, and this was in 2012, he died, of course, Shujat was killed later. He said the PSA is the worst example of brazen misuse of the powers vested with the executive. The Jammu and Kashmir High Court has from time to time cautioned against the misuse of this act, but it continues unabated. Since 1990, almost 2,000 people were booked under this law. The cases were largely against civilians, but the press was no exception, in spite of the fact that there is no specific mention about the media under the Public Security Act. And he goes into a lot of the case studies. I'll share that, the link to this document later. But there were a number of voices of people who said that there was such a high degree of censorship. Some of the women journalists we spoke to, and there are a number of very wonderful women journalists who work from Kashmir. Many of them used, all kinds of attempts to try and get the news. They said that, like, for instance, one of them pretended that she was pregnant and needed to access medical care, and that's how she managed to get into the hospitals. So a lot of them continued to be very, very innovative in the way they tried to collect news, but the space was shrinking so much. So one of the owners of the newspapers who we spoke to said he decided not to publish because he didn't want to bring out a pamphlet. Another newspaper owner said that he felt immensely guilty towards his readers because he could not give them the real picture. There are others who said there's no access to officials. Our stories are complete, but when the officials refuse to speak to us, we cannot put out our story until it becomes too late and the story itself becomes irrelevant. So many of them said, what we witness, we cannot write. And that seems to be the overriding voice that comes out, that they are bearing witness. They are they are seeing what is happening, but they're unable to speak about it. And this was in 2019. But as of right now, we have, a number of them who write in and who say that they dare not speak, they dare not risk even sharing these stories to people like us. I wanted to end this, this thing about the voices by bringing in something that Fahad actually shared with us when he was in 2020, 1 year after the abrogation. We recorded the voices of a number of Kashmiris, and Fahad actually was one of them. And he said that the silence of the barrel of the gun and the fear of jail would not last forever. But frankly, at this stage, we're really wondering how long that is going to last.
Wow. Just before we go to questions, Rakib, Geeta talked about bearing witness and being unable to speak. What's been your role and the role of other brave journalists in exile? How have you tried to speak and give voice to the voiceless? Talk a bit about your personal experience in exile.
Well, Julian, it is a little bit, I would say a little bit tricky. If you're talking about Kashmiri journalists living and working outside India and who at the same time have strong family ties to Kashmir, unfortunately, there is little they can do. Every Kashmiri journalist working outside the valley, outside Kashmir, is on the radar of Indian authorities. Every single word they write or say, either in their reports or social media, is closely monitored. And just one critical word or sentence is enough for them to go after your family. And it happened, I'm sharing my personal story here again. It happened to me in September 2020. While I was in the US, I just put out a tweet questioning a custodial killing in Kashmir. And within 24 hours, the top officers of all the army units in my district started calling my father, my uncle, and cousins, asking for my details and details of my parents and siblings. Eventually, my father was called to an army camp and told explicitly by an army officer to tell me to stop what I was doing. Even though I don't report on Kashmir anymore, and sometimes I just tweet stories covered by other journalists, Kashmiri journalists, the Indian authorities have been continuously hounding me and my family members. Just last year, a senior Indian police officer called me inquiring about my whereabouts, where I studied, what kind of news orgs I worked for, the countries I traveled, and my ideological inclinations. This call lasted for an hour. My father gets calls every other month from security forces and intelligence bureau, and one particular intelligence bureau officer inquiring about my whereabouts and when I plan on coming back. And they are desperately waiting for my return to Kashmir. But yeah, at the same time, as journalists, we know the risks associated with this job, and sometimes we have to make choices. And I made mine to stand up and speak despite knowing the risk to me and my family. And knowing what is happening with our colleagues back home, I think it is incumbent upon Kashmiri journalists who are living and working outside Kashmir to stand up and speak for their colleagues. And at the same time, I think we need to work on building an independent news organization, or what I call it, exile media organization, that can fill the information and news vacuum created by the state crackdown on press in the region. So I think, yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now. And that's the minimum that Kashmiri journalists living and working outside Valley and India can do right now at this moment.
All right, well, I think you've all, okay, go ahead, Geeta. Yep.
I just want to add one more point, is that while while we are focused on Kashmir, what we're also seeing is the kind of crackdown on the media in India. And
important.
And it's something that affects the dissemination of news across the board, and it would affect the people of Kashmir even more because they are in a very, very severe, critical state of conflict. So earlier, when we did work on free speech, for instance, in India, we looked at conflict areas, places where there was conflict. But now that seems to be all over the country. The second point I wanted to make is what Rakib said about the story he was doing on dams. And I've been looking a lot at environmental damage. And of course, all of us are conscious of climate change and the effect of climate change. So this is also an area of huge concern, really. We all need to be worried about what is going to be happening to the environment because of the way in which environmental laws are being changed in India, and also in the use of conflict areas to exploit the environment. I mean, the link between them. I think we need to look a little more closely at what is happening there. It worries.
All right. I just want to, much as well. Okay, Rakib, just talk. I'll give you 30 seconds because we've got some really good questions.
I'll just add to what Geeta said about the dam, just to give you a little peek into what's going on in Kashmir. I did this one story. Within 50-mile radius of this one region in Kashmir, India is building 7 big dams. 7 big dams within 50-mile radius. You know how disastrous that is for the river and the region and the people. And thousands of people are being displaced as a result of construction of this dam.
Wow. Look, you've all raised some amazing, eye-opening perspectives, combination of personal stories and giving us good context. Ange has been collecting some of the questions from our audience. So let's have our first question, Ange.
Hi, thank you, Julian. The first question is from Elaine. Elaine asks, why isn't the international media covering the situation in Kashmir? Can they not get into Kashmir?
No.
Man, no.
They're not allowed to. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you need special permissions to enter into Kashmir, and why will the Indian state give you that permission?
Wow. I mean, that's quite remarkable when you think about it, right? Because, I've been to Afghanistan, there's other war zones, even in some of the worst places, Syria, Yemen, there are journalists who manage to get in. It's
So
quite
David
shocking
Barsamian
repression.
tried to come. David Barsamian tried to come, and I think a few years ago, but he was deported.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And quite frankly, it's not just Kashmir, to be very honest. It's also, there are parts of Northeast border areas. So you need special permission from the Indian state, Indian government, the foreign ministry specifically, to enter these areas. And if you do, then you're deported back. And in the last couple of years, we have heard a lot of deportations. So that becomes, however, on the other hand, Indian state does invite European Union member of parliaments, and guided tour is always organized if you want to. Julian, we can ask them to watch that.
Probably media.
Yeah, no, we want the truth, and it's really hard to get out. That's quite shocking. All right, Angie, next question. Ange?
Sorry, may I just add one thing? You know, it was really
Absolutely.
shocking. Like immediately after the abrogation, I think within months you had this bunch of member of parliament, European member of parliaments, Rakib, I recall, and they were given a guided tour, and they were taken to the Dal Lake, which is the biggest lake in Srinagar, and all of that. And there were all these photographs, and there's absolutely nobody on the streets. Absolutely nobody on the
Yeah, and they were saying it was very peaceful because it was a guided. Of course, it's going to be peaceful when there is no one going to be on the street. Of course, like you didn't see
We
any.
have to understand what they mean by peace.
Yeah,
And just contrast it with what's going on right now in Ukraine because of social media, because the international media is there. We're getting gripping daily, if not hourly, images, and this is going on in Kashmir year after year after year, and there's this complete blackout. Next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee, they asked, this year has seen increased intimidation, incarceration of Kashmiri journalists and human rights defenders. With international media being restricted from entry, UN special rapporteurs not allowed to visit, and the ICRC's activities curtailed. Is there a sense as to why India wants to restrict information flow and reporting from the ground?
why? Of course, they're committing egregious human rights violations in the valley, and that's why they don't want world to see. They just want to promote their facade of democracy, and they want to hide all beneath it. So that's why they don't want free flow of information, and that's why they're battering the press in Kashmir.
Yes, and also, they definitely have they're very conscious of an international image. The Indian government is very, very conscious of an international image. So they don't want anything that can affect that international image. So a lot of journalists in Kashmir, for instance, are unofficially told that they're on a no-fly list. I've tried to find out how, and how does one actually figure that out? But they've been told that they cannot travel abroad, so they cannot speak in international fora.
The next question, Ange. That was a good question and great answers.
Yeah, the next question is from Desmond, and Desmond says, regarding human rights, including press freedom in Kashmir in India, is there interaction taking place with Hindus for human rights and similar movements? Desmond says, fair-minded Hindus, of which there are hundreds of millions, are probably the most likely people through whom human rights in Kashmir will be accomplished. Could you comment on this, please?
Geeta, would you like?
Yeah. No, go ahead. I wish there is a stronger voice from Hindus or from anybody else on what is happening in Kashmir and the kind of repression on civil liberties everywhere across India too. People in Kashmir used to taunt us at one point of time. I mean, colleagues in Kashmir used to say, look at what's happening in your own areas. You're like coming here, but see what's going to happen to you. And there really needs to be a much greater voice from, I don't know if one could just say Hindus, but everybody who's interested in civil liberties.
Yeah. Yep, true. I agree. And just to add what Geeta said, uh, the Kashmir model of repression is right now being implemented in India. All these 3 decades, like, people were, silently watching it unfold. Now it's in India as well. You see the case of Siddiq Kapan and other journalists, being hounded and targeted. And with respect to this particular question, I think he's referring to the diaspora, the Indian diaspora. I think broader Indian diaspora does need to get involved because it affects them as well, because slowly the international perception of India is changing. People are getting to know more about Kashmir. What happened in August 2019, it was actually a shot that, India literally shot on its own foot by highlighting this Kashmir whole conflict at the international scale. Now, a lot of people know more about Kashmir than they would do before 2019. So people are getting to know, and I think for people living in diaspora, for Indians, they need to really get involved and at least look at Kashmir as a humanitarian issue, right? Let's not go into politics or anything, but let's talk about the human rights of the people. Let's give them the basic rights. So I think, that is very much that we need right now. And Hindus for Human Rights, I have seen their work. They're doing good, but yeah, hopefully they will scale it up.
Next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question is from Carrie, and Carrie asks, what you've described about what has happened to Kashmiri journalists is truly troubling. Are there things that Canadians could do that would be useful?
Kunal, can you maybe talk about CPJ? We will, and Jim will give you a reference to all of you watching. We will post a list of the resources. Geeta mentioned some, and we'll get some from all our speakers. But Kunal, can you maybe address that and talk about the CPJ's work?
So Canada is already part of a media coalition of governments who support press freedom. And I think that's itself is a huge, huge move, because here are certain states and certain governments who are committing to the right to press freedom, which unfortunately India, in spite being so-called the largest democracy on earth, only serves lip service to, quite frankly. I mean, if it was so keen on it, perhaps could have joined this group of nations. In terms of, as Canadians, what you can do, I guess, is, I think to support in whatever way you can. I mean, there is quite frankly little that you can do directly, except for perhaps, showing solidarity with these journalists. Even as CPJ, there is only that much that we can do, because, first of all, CPJ does not have a ground office either in India or in Kashmir. So we can only kind of document. We try to document as many as Geeta does as well. I think documentation is a huge part. I mean, perhaps the question like, why is Kashmir not heard so much, can be resolved by more and more documentation. So that's number one. And number two, of course, we offer safety advisories. We offered it to Rakib when he was being targeted. I mean, that's based on our experience of having dealt with other conflict zones in other parts of the world, we can only advise, and that's what we do. And then thirdly, of course, from CPJ's point of view, we try to do advocacy with the government. We try to meet up with different stakeholders within the government, and because we are not, like, at least as CPJ, I can say that we are not in conflict with the government. We want to work with the government to sort out issues. Sometimes these issues might, we are not the ones who are just constantly just calling out the government, but also we do background behind the doors advocacy, try to resolve issues, try to see where, if somebody can be left off without being necessarily just calling on the government all the time, like publicly calling out the government all the time. So there are some of these things that we attempt to do. Quite frankly, I do not have like the thing that we can do and resolve a magic wand to resolve or all the issues, but yeah, so there is a limited scope, and we try to do most of it.
As I said, and Jim will reference this as well, when this videos posted tomorrow, there will be a list of resources for this issue and other press freedom issues. So that was a good question. Next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee, they ask, why have Indian mainstream media accounts of events in Kashmir been so different than local Kashmiri media in the past?
Geeta, ma'am.
Difficult one. Well, there is mainstream media, which has been actually very responsive to what has been happening in Kashmir, mainstream print media especially. Television is very, very different. Television in India is extremely polarized, and the majority, the really big, powerful television channels in India are they're extremely partisan in their approach, and they don't invest as much in news gathering on the ground. So what they do is have a lot of very, very virulent kind of talk show, the talk show model, so they don't actually know what is happening on the ground. They don't want to know. So they have these kind of experts and a lot of discussion, which is very, very, high volume, lots of vitriol and lots of hate news. Now, why does that happen? Why is it that this kind of thing happens? Is I think a little bit to do with the fact that India's media, mainstream media, does not wish to challenge government as effectively as it should across the board. Obviously there are very, very good exceptions. There are excellent exceptions and fabulous stories that come out from within India and in the Indian media. But the government's notion that national interests and national security and safety are paramount is never really challenged in the way it should. And we see this in many, many instances, not necessarily only in Kashmir. So India's mainstream media would be happy to accept what the government says about national interest. And now that's been the situation for a long time. When you add the Kashmiri aspect to it, which is about a disputed territory for which ownership is being claimed and being extracted in some ways, the situation changes. So a lot of India's mainstream media, for instance, would be very sharp on issues of human rights, perhaps. But when it comes to the essential, the core of the entire issue in Kashmir, which is about independence or autonomy or anything else, mainstream media will not take it on. This wasn't the situation earlier. There was a lot of debate within India in earlier years. I have attended meetings in India when I was younger and I was in active journalism, where people did debate issues of self-determination. That's a bad word now. Very simply,
Yeah. And if I may,
put you in jail.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Rakib.
Oh, I'm saying that word is enough to put you in jail in India right now.
Yes,
Kunal,
unfortunately.
you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, so I wanted to point out two things. One is that I recall when I traveled to Kashmir after the abrogation, and I just tried to look at how was the newspapers covering it. The top newspapers of Kashmir were covering it. And I went to each of their office and just kind of had a look at their editorials. And I was shocked that, except for I think one or two who still had editorials for the first 2 days, rest of them were reporting about, let's say, the toilets not being cleaned and garbage lying here and there and some esoteric kind of topics altogether. So, we see that even the mainstream newspapers in Kashmir, and including newspapers of a great journalist that Geeta just mentioned, who was assassinated, they completely kind of either ignored the topic. It's not such a big thing. I mean, if newspapers are a documentation of history, Kashmiri newspapers would say absolutely nothing about what happened in August 2019. I mean, you see the editorials. I was just shocked. Like even it was not even like a neutrality, just completely ignored that topic. So
and
to add,
even that is being now obliterated because archives of newspapers are being erased as we speak.
yeah, to add to Kunal, what he mentioned, I think, I remember one of the mainstream, one of the top Kashmiri newspapers on August 5th, they came out with an op-ed, how to prevent cardiac arrest, like, what kind of diet you should have to prevent the crime. But yeah, the reason is not that they deliberately ignored the topic. The reason is the continuous pressure on them. Before August 5th, I think for 2 straight weeks, the security forces were visiting the offices of each and every small and big newspaper in the valley to, like, tell them to toe the line. Otherwise, either they would get their advertisements withdrawn or, put in jail altogether. So this was kind of a fear that was created in their minds. And of course, like, if you're living in Kashmir, if you have family, of course, journalism is there. You had to do the job, but you cannot risk it all, like, for doing a story. And, when such a kind of fear Indian state puts in the society, and, so, yeah.
Not easy.
Julian, sorry. Yeah, sorry if I may add one thing.
Sure.
See, I think one topic that we didn't really talk about, and when we are talking about the Indian state, is also what changed after 2014. As Rakib mentioned, that he started doing his journalism from 2014. The fact that there is a Hindu majoritarian government in place also makes a world of a difference. That's something that we'll have to accept and take into account. Because this is not the same Indian state which existed before 2014. There is there is a massive change even within the Indian polity and politics since 2014. There is almost what we call the end of the Nehruvian consensus. Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India, and there was till like 14, there was certain ways of, at least on the paper, you accepted that you had certain rights. But even now, so post 14 and subsequently in 2019, when the same government came back with greater numbers in the parliament, there has been almost a tectonic shift when it comes to understanding of certain civil rights and rights within the Indian constitution. And that's why we are seeing, for example, I remember when last CPJ's count in last year, when we did the number of journalists in jail, there were around 7. And out of the 7, I think 6 had UAPA against them, which is the anti-terror law. And so the UAPA is not just being used in Kashmir. Now, we talked about the Kashmirization of Indian press. And that's what we are seeing also outside Kashmir, and even usage of national security as an excuse.
Important point. We only have about, maybe 5 minutes, a bit more. We don't want to run too much over. And I think we have about 4 questions left. So what we're going to try to do is Ange will shoot out a question. I'm going to ask one of the 3 of you to volunteer, only one of you, give a short answer, and we'll try to get through the 4 remaining questions. Ange, why don't you give us our next question?
The next question, Fuad asks, can one of the panelists speak to the activities of the Pakistan Army and authorities? Is part of Jammu and Kashmir occupied by Pakistan forces?
All right, who wants to take that? And you'll have 30 seconds to answer.
My favorite topic. Let me quickly.
I knew it was going to be you, Kunal.
there is a part of Kashmir which is under Pakistan control, and here we are talking about the Indian controlled Kashmir. So one isn't trying to discount the problems that exist in that part of Kashmir, but here our specialities, at least all 3 of us, are on the India controlled Kashmir. I hope that I answered that question.
Important, and it was important to be raised. Next question, Ange.
The next one from an attendee. A media monitoring cell in the J&K police is reportedly keeping files on Kashmiri journalists. Is this unprecedented in a democracy?
Not Who wants to handle it? Ita?
Yeah, I don't think it's unprecedented. We're aware of the fact that it used to be done even, during the emergency when um, Indira Gandhi imposed an emergency in India in the 70s. But we have to consider about whether it is a democracy then.
Very important point. Next question, Ange.
The next one, an attendee asks, says, some of you have mentioned social media posts briefly. Can you elaborate how these platforms are facilitating censorship?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. Yeah, over the past few years, we have seen a lot of Kashmiris who used to discuss a lot of Kashmiri conflict on Twitter disappear altogether. So there are two sides to it. One is censorship happening on the ground, where police calls them over, like, interrogates them. And the second is the platforms itself. And Indian government, I think there was a recent policy change, and now they have more control over, like, what they can ask these social media companies to take down. So they can just shoot a letter to Twitter India and tell them to take down the tweet, and they will just willingly and happily do that. But yes, in terms of K Twitter, that's Kashmiri Twitter, it has totally disappeared. No more Kashmiri discussions on there. First is censorship on the ground that results in self-censorship, and also because these social media platforms deliberately kind of, like, takes down the content that they feel is going to irk the Indian government.
We're still getting a yes.
And the Indian government among the largest number of takedown requests.
Yeah.
On YouTube or Facebook.
Both in terms of internet shutdown and takedown. India is the highest.
Documented by the transparency report, so you can see that.
Wow. We keep getting more questions. They're good questions, so let's keep trying to answer them. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next one, an attendee asks, says, Kashmiri media archives are being deleted. Is this a new phenomena in the digital age?
Yeah, one of you mentioned it. It's quite stunning. So can one of you answer that?
Yes, it is a new phenomenon, and it really reflects a little bit on the responsibility of the media to be a record of history. It's obliterating that responsibility completely. I mean, it's obliterating that history and denying that responsibility. The digital age, one has this illusion that we have digital freedom, and unless we have better programs, I think coders need to give us on preserving our freedom, we are still going to be struggling to maintain that.
Yeah, it's quite stunning, because all three of you kept referring to the idea of silencing, and there's the repression going on, the jailings, the forcing people like Rakib to flee. But then the ultimate silencing is not just keeping the truth from coming out, but erasing the truth of the past, rewriting history. It's quite frightening. And one more question, I think our final question.
Yeah, the next question is from Sebastian. Sebastian asks, can you suggest a good and reliable source of info on the situation in Kashmir?
Perfect way to end our panel, because we'll be talking about resources. Any suggestions for where people can go for good stuff on Kashmir?
I would say in some of the independent publications coming out of Kashmir, also publications in Delhi, which publish a lot of stuff on Kashmir. Kashmir Wala is definitely a place that I visit quite often. The Wire in Delhi is a place where they publish a lot of independent voices from Kashmir. Scroll, to an extent. News Laundry also does some bit of stuff on media. CPJ, if you want us to, of course, I'm not based out of Kashmir, but I do get information out of Kashmir whenever I'm reporting on press, and I try to keep it as authentic as possible. So yeah, there are far less than they were previously, but yeah, and then of course people like Rakib and others. Unfortunately, I think since the arrest of Fahad and Sajjad, there is at this very moment, there is a chilling effect in Kashmir. I know personally that a lot of Kashmiris have gone silent. They're so scared. They don't know. Kashmiri journalists, I mean, they're not sure who's going to be next, because there is an arrest warrant against a senior journalist, and 2 journalists are already behind bars. So a lot of journalists they are self-censoring at this point. But I would suggest that you should look out for independent voices from the Valley, and you will find their articles here and there somewhere, whether within India or abroad.
Rakib, where do you go for?
Oh yeah, if the looking at the history of Kashmir and what's going on in there, I think I would refer them to one of the co-sponsors of this event, that is Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network. They have some good resources put on their website. And in the US, there is Stand with Kashmir. They have excellent resources on their website. People should definitely check them out as well, to know the real side of it, like, what's really happening there on the ground.
Geeta?
As a journalist, I think we need to look at multiple sources, not just one reliable source. And there are multiple reliable sources. For history, there's nobody to beat A.G. Noorani, who's done fabulous, who's written, whatever has helped us all to understand what has happened in Kashmir. Then there's factual information on the ground, which we put out, which CPJ puts out as much as we can. So for perspective, I think it's good to look at, scholars who are trying to provide larger perspective on what is happening there.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And obviously the purpose of this panel was to also get information out and end the silence. So I'd like to thank, obviously, our 3 great guests. You guys were quite eye-opening and insightful. And I'd like to thank the Center for Free Expression for giving us this platform. I'm going to pass it back to Jim Turk, who can tell you all how you can keep informed about this important story and so many other press freedom issues. Jim?
Well, thank you, Julian. And I want to thank the panel as well. You 3 were really tremendous. And I think you did a fine job moderating, Julian. And I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. I hope you found it as engaging and important a discussion as I did. As Julian mentioned, tomorrow we'll be posting a video of this on our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca, and on our YouTube channel. And we'll also be posting a list of resources. So Geeta and Kunal and Rakib mentioned various things. We'll put those in, as well as others, for any of you who want to learn more. Things you can read, videos you could look at, podcasts you can listen to, or whatever. So that'll be on our website, cfe.ryerson.ca, tomorrow. Our next event is going to be in 2 weeks, on Tuesday, March 15th. And it's going to be a conversation, the title of which is The Future of Democracy in an Era of Social Fragmentation. It's going to feature Tara Henley, who's a Toronto journalist, broadcaster, and author of a national bestseller called Lean Out, a meditation on the madness of modern life. And she's going to be in discussion with Samira Gandesha, who's a leading public intellectual in Canada and director of the Institute for Humanities at Simon Fraser University. So that'll be 2 weeks, Tuesday, March 15th at 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. We'll be on daylight time by that point, so summer is coming. For those of us in Toronto, it's been very cold. It's hard to believe, but there it is. For more information about all of the CFE panels and conversations, of which there's been about 100, the videos are on our website. A list of the upcoming events for the next 2 months are there as well. And also our blog and resource material deal with many aspects of expressive freedom and the public's right to know. So I hope you'll join us for future events. And again, I really want to thank the panel for a tremendous event tonight. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.